Are you becoming more selfless, or are you becoming more self-focused?
That's a beautiful transition, man. So let's roll this
All right,
clip.
let's roll it.
I never considered that thinking about your problems all the time and talking about your problems all the time literally make the problems grow.
That's right. I mean, it's the number one symptom of depression is what they call rumination, this pathological obsessing over your pain.
Yeah.
That's why stuff like exercise, that's one of the reasons, aside from chemical reasons, one of the reasons that doing anything, you know that running errands is good for your mental health? Getting out of your house and accomplishing anything is good for you. But sitting around talking and thinking about your problems, that's a bad habit. And the best cognitive behavioral therapists and others, you know, the dialectical behavioral therapists, the ones who do really well with depression, the first thing they do is try to break that bad pattern. But a lot of therapists just indulge it.
Wow. I mean, I think it's spot on, right? So the first thing is ruminating on why you're depressed. I mean, just thinking about that, I mean, just talking about yourself all the time. And I've encountered this with some of the guys that, I've discipled or had relationships with, where they just constantly talked about what was going on and bringing up the past and stuff. And it's like they were living in their depression, living in it.
It becomes part of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that can happen with depression or some kind of sadness, and this isn't to pick one issue, but one of the really common issues I see for people going to Christian counselors in our age group is a breakup.
Yes.
So they have a rough breakup and they go to a counselor. Now, have you ever seen the movie Inside Out? It's a kid's movie, so this is me having nieces and nephews.
I feel like I have.
Okay, so there's this great scene. One of the characters is Sadness, and it sits with an imaginary character, and they need the imaginary character to do something. And Joy, another character, tries to get this imaginary character to do it by being happy and going through it and jumping away from the problem, not dealing with it at all. But Sadness comes and sits with the character and basically says, that's really sad what happened to you. And the character talks about it a little bit more. And Sadness goes, yeah, that's really sad. And finally, he says his last statement, and Sadness goes, wow, that's really sad. Then they get up, and they go do the task at hand. So one of the things I will always say as a caveat to what Abigail said there is the idea that there is a time to grieve and sit with sadness. There is a time to talk about what's happened, and that's not going to be linear, and there's not a shot clock on it. You need community, and you need people that love you and care about you to sit and hear what's going on in your life, and to sit and talk about things that are bugging you. And a therapist can be, depending, that person. I think it's often overprescribed in areas like breakups. But what then happens is we obsess and we talk, and this breakup goes on for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year or longer.
Right.
And you have sat with this for so long and ruminated on this for so long, and you think about that person, and the reality is it's not real anymore. Those are memories. That person that you knew no longer exists. You're not the person you were when you were with them. What comes a point where, like she said, with exercise, whether it's serving, whether it's making new friends, whether it's playing pickleball, whether it's putting gas in your tank, whether it's cooking, those things aren't going to be pleasant while you're depressed. But going and doing those things makes life better. You have to get back to living. And so I always say this caveat to people, like, there is a time to sit with sadness. That needs to happen. We are not saying that if you are sad, the only solution is to go exercise. The only solution is to go for a walk. However, once you have sat with sadness for a time, it is then time to get up and get going. And there's not going to be some light bulb moment where, for most people, that they're like, okay, now it's time to get back to life. You are going to have to force some of these things. And it's great if you're in community that can pull you. So this is a statement to all communities. If you have someone in your group, some of your friends that are going through something like this, get them, pull them, bring them, keep the invites going. But for those people that have been stuck for so long, and your counselor gave you a great point, are you serving somewhere? I know you're sad, but you can still work in kids ministry. I know you're sad, but you can still work on the production team. I know you're upset, but there are other people that are going through things and you can help them.
Right.
And so I think this is such an amazing statement, because if all you're doing is thinking about your hurt and there's nothing else in your day, that's a bad day.
I mean, that's rough. I think too, and you mentioned kind of a timeline, and I think that this is something, and this goes for anybody who's in community or leading a Bible study or whatever. If there's somebody there that has been in the same place for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, and you've been helping bear the burden, as I believe Galatians 5 or 6 says, there's a point where you have to have a difficult conversation, I think. I think there's a point where you have to say, hey, you guys broke up a year ago and you're still bitter about it, right? And I think that therapy, unfortunately, has a moral hazard in that the therapist is getting paid. So the longer you're there, the more they get paid, right? And I think as Christians, we shouldn't be looking at it that way. We should be looking at, hey, my community is lifting me up so that I'm growing, I'm being sanctified, and I need to be lifting the people in my group up so that there's growth.
There's different times I can think of different friends, or even myself from different things in my life, where people were letting me wallow for too long. Mm-hmm. And I've let friends of mine wallow for too long, because it's not an attack if in love you push someone to heal.
Yeah. Do you think that is, and this is a question, and Marilyn, maybe want to unmute your mic because this might apply to you. Do you think there's a difference in the way that men and women kind of handle that?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah?
Think about growing up for me. So growing up for me, great Canadian story, so Marilyn will like this one. I played really competitive hockey growing up. My dad walks in late to a hockey game. I take a puck off the ankle, blocking a shot, doing the right good Canadian kid thing to do, right? Mm-hmm. My mom's sitting with the hockey moms. I'm in pain on the bench. I jump the boards and everything. And my dad walks in, and my dad goes, Cam's hurt? My mom goes, yeah, you should go see him. And my dad goes, oh, where did it hit him? And she goes, I think it got him in the ankle. And my dad goes, well, that's a long way from his heart. He's going to be just fine. And after the game, my mom came over to me and was helping me and trying to figure out what's wrong with my foot. We need to go to the hospital, get an x-ray, do all these different kind of things. And my dad didn't acknowledge it at all. I was hopping, limping, doing all sorts of things. But I think that story translates to oftentimes how men and women can deal with these things. If you came to me with something hard, I would listen to you, we'd talk about it, and that'd probably be all for the first night. But if it was a pretty minor issue and you were still talking about it, at some point in time as a guy, I would hope I'd come to you and be like, dude, it's been a week, man. It's time, Jared.
Right.
And I think for women, the runway is often longer, and it's often met with that person sad, I need to love them up. Now, this is not all women, this is not all men. But I think that men should get to the place of confronting sooner. One thing that we struggle with as men is passivity. So we may never confront them, but we just won't talk about it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that women have a longer runway where they may not confront them, but they probably are less likely to walk away. So there's pitfalls on both sides. But I think that men would more likely be confrontational sooner, and then also more likely to just leave the problem and not talk about it anymore. Where women, I think, oftentimes would have a longer runway, but wouldn't bring confrontation as quickly.
Yeah. So what you're effectively saying is that women are going to be more empathetic and loving, but that in the long term could be a problem, whereas men are probably going to be like, I don't know if I want to deal with this, but if they do, it's probably going to be more restorative faster.
Yeah. So Marilyn, check our notes. Were we on track there with our thoughts, or are we completely off base with these big generalizations?
You're on track. Completely. I would consider myself to be in the middle, I think. Definitely women are just more of that nurturer, so we would listen and there's definitely a longer runway. But I can be a little blunt, so I can get to probably the point that we need to get to a little faster.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Well, and I struggle with the passivity thing too. I would be the guy that would say to you, if the situation you probably needed a week, I'd probably give you close to a month, because I'm like, Jared's going to get this together. I don't need to have that conversation with him just yet. And now there is a point where it breaks, and because I love you, I'd be like, all right, dude,
yeah,
I probably should have had this with you 3 weeks ago, but we're having it now. So I think that's the big pitfall for men too.
Yeah, and I think that men that are in community, you have to be willing to do that too. Mm-hmm. And I know that men are more likely to do that, I think, than women.
Yeah.
And so obviously, we're speaking from male perspective, but women probably need to think about that a little bit more. Be a little bit more confrontational.
In love. That's one of the things,
yeah.
is we have made confrontation something that is meant to now be unloving, which it's not. Like the Bible gives us, like, I would use the example of if there's a believer in your church that's dealing with a sin, you take them aside and say, hey, like between you and I, this is a problem. And if that doesn't work, you go get a couple people and you do it again. And then you get the congregation to do it again. Now that's specifically a prescription for someone that's dealing with a persistent sin, but I think it kind of holds true for someone that is stuck in depression, where you would go to them as a friend individually and say, hey man, like it's been a minute, like what's going on? What do we need to do to get you going again? And if they don't respond to you, then you come back with a group and say, hey, we love you. We know it's time. And then if that doesn't work, then you go get pastoral help in the rest of the church and say like, okay, this person needs more.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because, I'm as conservative as the next Christian. But, I think that there is an issue with kind of the mentality, the individualistic mentality of like lifting yourself up by your bootstraps and, hey, you've got to be a man and do it all yourself and stuff.
To our listeners, this is a huge thing coming from Jared. So keep going. I want to hear where this goes. Yeah.
No, but I think that as Christians, as men, like we are called to be the same empathetic, loving people that women tend to be. Now they kind of miss probably on the correction side, right? And men, if you have that mentality of that's your problem, you deal with it.
Right.
That's not correct,
not
right? So, you definitely have to have that empathy, and we have to remember that our faith says that God is meeting you where you are, and there are so many people that are in a completely different place than you are when they met Jesus, and it's our job as disciples to disciple.
And you know what? That's why the Bible, like anxiety is a huge thing that we see a ton of, right? I mean, anxiety is a massive thing on the rise, as well as depression, and it tells us to cast all our anxiety onto them. But that's really hard when you're anxious. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to say you should serve somewhere, but it is really hard when you're depressed. And I think everything you're saying is perfect, because we are saying these things are good for you, but it has to be done with a tremendous amount of love and empathy, because these people are hurting and life is really hard. Mm-hmm. But if we do love you truly, then we are going to help pull you out of it, because the worst thing we can do is leave you there. So even though it hurts, even though it is scary, so it's having the empathy and recognizing that these people are in pain. Mm-hmm. However, it is actually more unloving to not try to pull you out.
Right. Absolutely. Before we jump to the next segment,
mm-hmm.
I do want to go back to something I touched on a little bit earlier, and it's to say, hey, we're not calling you to disciple somebody that you may be unequipped to handle.
This is a great
and
point.
this is something that I think we have to continually say. If somebody is suffering, if they're in a manic state, like you are not equipped to do that. You're not equipped. If I know of a pastor or an elder at a church who was telling me that this church is set up by a major university, and they have seen so many students come in that they walk in that church and it's their last lifeline. It's their last moment before they're about to take their lives. And this church just had to go, hey, we're not equipped for this. Like, we've never seen this before. Like, they're saying, well, they've been around 2 decades. They've never seen it like this before, right? And they're going, okay, we have to invest in the resources and the people that are equipped to deal with this. And so, again, we're talking about, like, the typical depression and anxiety and reasons why. Yeah. And we're not talking about those major things, because that is something that, professional help is definitely needed for.
And like we said in the disclaimer, I think that's such a good point to bring up again, because as this conversation goes on, I wish we had more words for the depression or the anxiety that we're using, right? Because there is a place that if you need pharmacological help, or if you need really intense, really specialized therapy, if you need those kind of people, or if you see someone that you can identify that needs those kind of people, my goodness, you get to them to that help, but you're not equipped, and I totally agree. Yes.
So if that comes into your community, in your Bible study, recognize it quick, because chances are you're going to do more harm than good.
Yep.
And also, like, you are going to become so stressed out because you're going to be taking the 3-hour long phone calls, and you're going to be dealing with things that you just can't deal with. So
Yeah, and I think you're making a great point, because we are supposed to rally around the people that we can help. Like we talked about, we don't want to be passive. And at the same time, there is a place to be like, this is beyond my tool set. And in fact, I can do you harm. So I'm going to be here for you as a friend, but not as your mental health professional, right?
yeah. So if you like that video, you can watch another one right here. And if you want to see the full podcast, you can click right here. And as always, 25% of all proceeds go to missions, and you can always check us out, disciples.us.